Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear alumni, dear friends of the MCI, dear media partners from Tiroler Tageszeitung, Südtiroler Wirtschaftszeitung, Tageszeitung Die Presse, dear partners of our distinguished guest lecture series, I may just name a few of them: Verband Österreichischer Wirtschaftsakademiker, Swarovski, Vöslauer, Deloitte, Studo, the student service app, Volkswirtschaftliche Gesellschaft Tirol, and our Jean Monnet Chair, European Values, Professor Frischholt. I'm more than pleased to welcome you here to this event, to our distinguished guest online live talk of today. I also may mention a special partner of today, Lebensraum Tirol. All great to have you here out there in the audience, wherever you may be now. But now, dear ladies and gentlemen, let me address our distinguished guest of today. Let me express a warm welcome to Jonas BaerHoffmann, the General Secretary of FIFPro. You are presently not in Amsterdam, but in Heidelberg. We cannot hear you now. I think you're still muted.
My bad. Thank you for having me. And yes, indeed, Corona puts me still in my home country instead of the workplace, yes.
Now, actually, we are very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you and to listen to your expertise and get insight into a world which is fascinating. We hear all these glamorous names and topics like, presently from the perspective of Austria, the transfer of David Alaba is in the media, but we have so many topics. We have, it is sexual harassment in the field of whatever, or abuse. We do not know what it really is about, but it is data security. It is how to deal with data in sports and so on. So let me really express my pleasure to have such a prominent guest and to talk about topics we normally do not really get insight to. Now, when it comes to this format, ladies and gentlemen, those who are familiar with this format know it already, but we normally talk about, we have now a time slot of roughly an hour in total, and I would just invite our guests to talk about the topic, and the topic is the world of sports professionals. And the subline says business. Now the business, the markets and so on, rights, salaries, discrimination, media, the media involvement, and much more. But we do not have to stick to these items. I think we are allowed to take the liberty to let's play by ear. But before we get into the topic, I would really try to present yourself, dear Jonas. Now, who are you and what are you doing?
That's an interesting question. Yes, so my title is I'm the General Secretary of FIFPro, which, General Secretary being basically CEO in a business sense. And FIFPro is, if you take the traditional view on it, it's basically an international trade union confederation. Just that instead of construction workers or telecoms people, we represent professional football players. We have our national members, most of them are really traditional trade unions. Some of them for legal reasons have different status. And they work in roughly 65 to 70 countries around the world, literally on every continent. And they represent as a group, and thereby through us, more than 60,000 professional football players, male and female. And literally everybody from somebody who earns maybe $100 somewhere in Gabon in the professional league and tends to not get that salary because the system is so broken, to Premier League players that you watch middle of the week in the Champions League or on the weekend in the Premier League, or of course also in Austria.
And now before we dive deep into your Vita and into FIFPro, I may just encourage our audience. There is the opportunity to raise questions, to send questions to our distinguished guest. The questions will be shown at my screen, which I have in front of me, and I will be happy to put the questions forward as much as I can. But how do you do that? Just drop an email to live talk at mci.edu. Sorry to be confused. It's the first time. Normally, I do not send myself questions to this email account. So again, livetalk at mci.edu, and I'll be more than pleased to put the questions forward as much as I can. Now, you have been mentioning something about FIFPro, but now FIFPro, what are the key challenges of FIFPro? How long has it been in existence? Who do you report to? If we may learn from that and then get started into the topic.
Yeah, sure. So 55 years ago, roughly, FIFPro was founded in 1965 in Paris. And it was literally just a handful of national organizations from France and Italy, England, Spain, etc., who came together and tried to basically create a player's voice confronting FIFA in the simplest sense, to try to get a global voice on that table. And it has grown then essentially over the last 20 years much faster than the previous 35. Why? Because of the Bosman ruling, which some people may be aware of, which created basically free movement for football players across borders after the EU integration of the free market. And after that, there was a huge spiraling effect. Who we're working with, we've achieved the sense that we are the counterpart representing the players in the football structures of FIFA, but we're also working with the confederation, so UEFA, etc. And then in the recent 10 to 15 years, the employers in the quote unquote sense, meaning the leagues and the clubs, have organized similar organizations as ours who are working more in a traditional social dialogue sense with. But of course, the topics, they range from really traditional employment topics. How is the contract? How is the arbitration forum you can go to when you're not getting paid? But then also questions around, now in the COVID period, of course, the health and safety protocols, reform of competitions and the impact of the match calendar. So how much rest do the players get? And then also, I have a couple of examples to that, really human rights questions around discrimination, sexual abuse, and the very essence of dignity as a human being. So it's very, very broad. But what I would say is that the public perception of what a professional footballer is very, very flawed.
Mm-hmm. And now, how does the organization work? If I were a professional football player and I'd be interested to work together with you or to receive support from you, I may become a member and there's a membership fee, or how does that work?
Yeah, you become a member. Ideally, in your country, there is a union that exists. In Austria, there is a union for the players. So you become a member of that union, and through that, you become a part of this global network automatically. And yes, indeed, it is like you would join a trade union because you work at your university and you pay a membership fee, you become a member, and you become part of a movement. And the interesting part, of course, is that it's not football. It's literally many, many sports around the world that have organized to the highest degree in the United States, where the entire sports governance system is built around unions and the leagues opposing each other in collective bargaining agreements. But of course, in whether it's rugby, whether it's cricket, whether it's ice hockey, etc., in all these sports, the unions have created more and more space for the voice of the athletes. And through that, you become part of a global movement, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And now, when I look at you now, how do you become the general secretary of such a confederation, or what is your background and your perspective to that? How did you get into this?
Yeah, this is maybe discouraging or encouraging for the students, depending on how well they do in your courses. No, I mean, I played a bit of basketball myself when I was, teenage and early 20s, was reasonably talented, but stopped because of injuries relatively early. But around the time when I ended up my high school degree, my coach at the time, he started to set up a comparably small union for the basketball players in Germany. And he essentially asked me to help out. He was American, so I was translating website articles, doing surveys for the players, little things, because when you're 19 and finishing high school, you don't have a lot of skills. You just do what needs to be done. And I never left. So a few years later, while I was in law school, I took over running this organization, got involved in European project work, and in 2012, moved to Brussels to do essentially the public relations, the public affairs work for the player unions across Europe. And from there, I pivoted into football, into a full-time role, and then worked myself through the institution. But indeed, you can't really study this. So I always say I have a vocational training in player union work, and I have 2 years in a law school, which I didn't finish. So there's the question for your students. Is that encouraging or discouraging? I don't know.
Take everything as encouraging, despite this little fact that I still would encourage our students to do their best to finish to complete their degrees. But
I agree. But there are other ways too. So
individual options to do that, and individual situations, obviously, as we all know. But Jonas, now the world of sports professionals, and I have been mentioning several topics or several strands what we may talk about, but I leave it to you. What do you think when we talk about your work and the world of sports professionals? What is it, what you find, what you would say to use the time best? What is the messages, the key messages you want to share with us?
Yeah, when I prepared for this, I obviously tried to find a way that I could share an idea of what actually makes this work. Because if I went through all the topics, then you would be listening now for an hour and a half and I wouldn't have got halfway. But I think what's interesting, I brought a few stories, and I don't have to tell them all, but I thought a few of those stories might help to get a sense for how this actually works. And I thought I'd bring initially a few players that probably nobody knows who's watching this. The gentleman that you see here is somebody called Jimmy Hill. He played in the 50s and then early 60s in England, in Fulham at the end of his career. And he was at that time in the late 50s, early 60s, he was the president of the Players Union in England. The English Players Association is the oldest in the world. It's 110 years old by now. But they had a problem at the time, the players, which was that there was a maximum wage or a salary cap. No footballer in England was able to earn more than £20 a week, which is more than that would be today, but it's still not a lot of money. And we're already talking about a time when there would be thousands of people coming to games. And of course they would pay for that and people would be making money, but they had a maximum wage. So what he did, he organized all the players in the league to threaten to strike, which at that time is very different than when you imagine today NBA players striking, because these guys had no protection. If they goes without wages for a few weeks, they have nothing to fall back on. Many of them had second jobs they needed to work. But they stuck together, and 3 days before the strike would have started, the clubs caved and they started to negotiate and they opened up. And what they created with that, and I think that's for a student is something interesting when you look at applying general principles to sport, they created a market. They created competition. They created the opportunity for capital and labor to start actually competing on more equal terms. And the interesting story behind it is that, and that is where I link to maybe the second part of this in a minute, is that while it is very difficult to organize athletes, and I think some of the people listening to this come from other sports which are not team sports and where this is even less developed, but the collective power that athletes have is very significant if they stick together. Why? Because if you look at sport as a product that you're selling, which to be honest, for most clubs it is by now, It's not the social value thing, it's a product. What's the single most important input to create that product? The athlete, it's the player. Without him or her, nothing functions. And you can't really replace them if you're at the top level, because people notice the difference. They don't run as fast, they don't jump the same way, they don't hit the ball the same way. The product changes immediately. So the collective power is very, very big. And this is the second story that links to that. This is a guy called Marvin Miller that you see here in the picture. This is about the same time as the 60s. He was not a player. He was a trade union organizer, a very traditional trade union organizer in the steel industry in the United States, who was negotiating literally collective agreements during war times for the production of war material, when the workers were looking for better wages. He was hired as the first executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. And he's essentially the godfather of the United States collective bargaining system, which really governs sport over there. Like all the big leagues, there are no federations running them like we have over here. It is in the agreements between the players and the clubs, which are combined in the leagues, that set up the entire game, the schedule, the rules of how the players move around, the business models, etc. And he has this favorite quote about, negotiating without leverage is begging, which meant that when he came in, he had to create this collective understanding of the leverage that the players have. And that is essentially, when you forget about the topics that we're working on, that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring the collective leverage of the players together so that they can advocate for the positions that they think they deserve, the human rights that they are entitled to, and to, of course, have an impact on the game to shape it the way that they think is the right way for the game to move forward. So that's a bit the history lesson, maybe. And I don't know if you want to discuss that, or if you want me to move on to where this applies maybe to today. I'll breathe for a second and give you a chance, Andreas, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, perhaps, you have been putting forward the topic of minimum or maximum wages, or the cap, which was fought against. And then several times the word trade union, and then now the history. But now, do the football clubs or the clubs, the profi clubs, how do they see your confederation, the FIFA? Do they hate you? Do they fear you? Do they respect you? Or do they actually approach you to look for solutions and to shape something together? Perhaps there is not a general approach, but how would you see that?
All of the above. It depends on the circumstance. No, obviously you also have to be honest. If we have 65 unions around the world, they don't all have that strength that I just described. Mm-hmm. That is what you're trying to get to. But of course, organizing players to do that is hard, and it's rare. But fortunately, in the most developed markets, it's also not necessary very often, because the conditions are actually at a stage where the players can be quite satisfied with. The relationship can be very difficult. Of course, there are times, and what I'm trying to maybe explain also a little bit today with what I mentioned in the opening, with the image of the player in the public's eyes being very flawed. Of the 60,000 players that we represent, maybe 3% are anywhere remotely comparable to what David Alaba experiences. Mm. And maybe really what he experiences is just 1%. The majority of the players that we represent is making at or below average domestic income. Mm. We have studies for the last few years that in a 2-year period of football, so over 2 seasons, roughly 40% of players worldwide at some point don't get their salaries paid. Sometimes for 1 month, sometimes for 3 months, sometimes for 6 months. We, of course, have enormous pressure in terms of violence and abuse, harassment around the workplace. So not all of these jobs are very, very luxurious, and maybe some of them are not even desirable. But in order to get there, they have to sacrifice a lot of their other educational background, their opportunities to socialize in a way that allows them to do other things in life. So there's a big dependence. And representing those players obviously is oftentimes hard, because you're dealing with clubs, they're not run like Red Bull Salzburg, with a very strong commercial compliance background and all the things you would want to see in a business of that size. Oftentimes they're run by people who are, well, a little bit dubious, I would say. If you try to, our work in Serbia looks very different, for example. So then it can be very contentious. It can be very confrontational. It oftentimes ends up in court. But at the same time, on the international level, there's oftentimes quite positive cooperation. For example, at the moment, over the last few months, we've done a lot of work with the clubs, with our counterpart on the club side, around the health and safety protections when players go and travel with their national teams during the COVID period. What are the testing requirements? What are the isolation requirements, quarantine requirements, etc.? So it's both, but it is interesting. It changes very often.
And if I may once again encourage and invite our audience to send questions to me. Once again, livetalk@mci.edu. That's the email address. Just send me an email, livetalk@mci.edu, and I will try to involve these questions into our dialogue. And before I try to include such questions, I would like to move forward with you wanted to mention other issues related to the topic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about, like, one thing that I wanted to share a little bit is how what I talked about in the previous two slides is applying today and what actually is happening today. And one of the most substantial and powerful movements in sport, certainly in our part of sport, is the way that female athletes, in our case football players, have really found their collective strength in the recent years. What you see here on the picture is, I think, something around 150 or 200 players of the Spanish First League at an assembly of the union. You see the little logo saying AFE here. That's our member, that's the union of players in Spain. And this was in 2019 when they reached a historic agreement with the league that essentially made the professional league in Spain a reality. Now, there's still some obstacles, but they increased wages, they increased social protections, they increased professionalization of the standards, the medical support, and all of these things that are around what it means to be a professional. They pushed through. But there are endless stories from New Zealand to Sweden to the United States where there is an enormous drive where these women are really finding that collective strength. And I think they're changing women's sports more than anybody else. And what's really powerful, and that's where I wanted to go a little bit with this story, is that in this moment, the things they fight for themselves connect, of course, with a very strong societal push for equality, gender equality, for social justice. And it gives them enormous strength to connect with this. And that is where the next story connects as well, what that means for racial justice or for the discrimination against people based on their skin color, etc. Who you have here, that's maybe the first one that some people might know. He's called Moise Kean. He's a very young player. At that time, this is also about a couple of years ago, he was playing for Juventus. At the moment, he's playing for PSG. And this was in a game against Cagliari in 2019. He was playing well. And the opposing fans thought the way to distract him or to vilify him was to make monkey chants and to basically to racially discriminate him and vilify him from the stands. Now, this is an infamous picture for me because he scored right in front of the stands where there were thousands of these people standing. And he was at that point 19 years old. But instead of being intimidated by that pressure and by that attack, he faced them up. And he stood in front of them and he basically, without saying, he told them, "You can't touch me. I just scored on you guys." And it's a great expression of what's happened around athlete activism over the last, I would say, 5 years around the world. In the United States, a bit longer, where you see that, especially around the cause of racism and gender discrimination, athletes have become activists for social change. And they've learned how to use their platforms to impact their communities. And it's very powerful to see. But at the same time, when you go back into football or sports, we have enormous problems. Like I always say, the pandemic before the COVID pandemic was the pandemic of racial attacks in football stadia in the season that we had before. We had every weekend, we had cases around Europe where players would get attacked, where players were close to walking off the pitch. The same is happening at the moment when you follow, especially in England, the social media vilification that athletes are receiving. And it is an expression of what sport also brings together. It brings together the best and the worst in people, and especially football, because it touches every part of our society. It brings together people with all kinds of belief system, all kinds of backgrounds, which are sometimes very negative. And football has a huge job to do, to change its own diversity in decision-making, to find ways to deal with these problems better, to actually lead in the way that sport says it always does, it impacting the society. Because right now it has huge struggles and it hasn't done enough. And the players are becoming the activists that change their own environments, but they're actually leading community change, societal change around these causes.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps I may come in here with a first question from the audience, and I'm more than pleased to put forward the question of a person you know, yeah. We all know, and who was very, very supportive in bringing us together and make this live talk possible. And the person is an MCI alumnus. He's a sports enthusiast, and his name is Luca Komployer from South Tyrol. And now I may put forward the question, and thanks again, dear Luca, for your engagement and your commitment regarding the MCI and this event. Now, two questions. The one is, now to you, Jonas, what is the situation like for supposedly smaller sports, such as winter sports or track and field? Why do athletes find it so difficult to set up their own representation there?
Yeah, there's a lot that could be said about this. I think there are some technical elements that make it a little bit harder on the athlete side. One being most of them not being employees. They were usually self-employed or have some other, civil law contract construction. So the traditional union model is a little bit more difficult. But it's also, the fact that you train as a team, the fact that you have 25, 30 players in the same dressing room allows you to organize collectively much differently than if you have an individual athlete who's maybe with 2 or 3 training partners traveling around the world in a very oftentimes isolated environment. But I don't think that those are really the problems, because the athletes would fix that if they could. Mm-hmm. To be very honest, I think it's the governance system of sport that holds them back consciously. Mm-hmm. That has chosen the model of representation for athletes that, yes, gives them a voice, but it doesn't give them influence. And we've seen globally how that is breaking apart. We have these discussions around the upcoming Olympics with what they call Rule 50, which is the right to essentially political or human rights-based protest, which athletes are fighting to have more freedom of speech. You have the question around Rule 40, which is about Olympic athletes not being compensated for actually participating in these games. And athletes are starting to speak up. And in a few countries, also in Germany, for example, these Olympic athletes have started to create associations. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting example, actually, the German one, because the government decided to co-fund them in order to have an independent voice next to the Olympic sports federations, next to the individual sports federations. But we have to be honest that the voice of athletes is really underrepresented in most sports, and it is consciously underrepresented because it's uncomfortable, because they're questioning maybe the current structures of power, and a lot is being done to hold it back, that they get this voice. So I think that is actually the biggest challenge, and that is where in my opinion, there's a bigger responsibility for government, because for these people, we're not talking about whether they make $1 million or $2 million a year. We're asking a question of, do they have social security? Do they have a health insurance when they injure themselves? I mean, Luca as a skier, it's an incredibly dangerous profession. Right? Like one mistake and you're done. And maybe not just with your sporting career, but with some parts of your life, because you can injure yourself so badly. What are the protections there? And I don't think sport is following its responsibility. And I think government is not engaging enough to help these athletes organize, represent themselves, and have the influence they deserve. So that's maybe part of the answer. But people like Luca who've tried to set these things up, I think, have a lot of experiences with how the system has actually worked against that push of an independent voice. And that needs to be called out, because that is a fundamental flaw in the democracy of sport.
May I come in here and just to ask a perhaps provocative question. Now, if Austria or Italy or Netherlands or any country said, okay, we establish deliberately because we want to avoid such suppression methods. We want the players to have social security and to have stability and all that and basic fundings and all that. Yeah. But then perhaps they have been more or less the public and the system has been allowing and securing all what I think we all desire and we all support. But then come then the big pro football clubs come and pay them. So the ones have had the investment and the others then take the benefit, including perhaps the football, the athlete. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't there be some kind of a mismatch in this systematic approach?
Look, in a way, there's two kinds of sports in the international environment. There are sports which are self-sufficient economically, mm-hmm. and there are sports that depend on the Olympic movement to be financially sustainable. Mm-hmm. And you have to treat them very differently. Mm-hmm. We work in a sport, the Olympic are not a significant economic factor for football, right? For most individual sports, it is. The platform is substantial, and therefore it creates an environment which also gives a lot of support, right? There's positive things in the system, like it's not all negative, but it's not decided by the athletes how it is structured. But you have to treat them differently, and I obviously think that the independence that we are striving for, we actually want independent funding. We want independent structures for our unions that aren't dependent on cross-funding from other sports organizations and the likes. But in individual sports, that's simply not, I don't think that's achievable in the short term. So you need that support system in order to establish the democratic, it's grassroots funding, right? It's capacity building. At some point, these athletes will find ways to fund these organizations through commercial activations and things like that, which is how most of the unions in the team sports are funded. So oftentimes through commercial activity. But right now, that's not a feasible model. And therefore, that cross-funding is needed. And I think if sport doesn't do it, then government should. Mm-hmm.
Now, Jonas, you have been emphasizing some topics like racism and also wages and social security and these issues. But if we look deeper into that, is there certain countries, if we even want to mention that, yeah, which are really well organized, where the situation of the athletes is comparatively well off, where there is still so much to do and lacking behind, if you may say that in such a term. Hmm?
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to football, which is what I know best because I work in it, we actually just 2 days ago, I think, beginning of this week, we published a report in which we analyzed the relationship between the economic capacity of a football market, the general socio-economic reality in a country, and the labor conditions. And of course, there is a certain correlation that in the economically strongest markets, the conditions are better. It's clear. English footballers in the top 2-3 leagues are doing pretty well. We all know that, right? It's not such a big issue. It's the same in Italy, in Germany, etc. But what is interesting is that at some point that correlation breaks, and the biggest markets don't necessarily provide the best employment or the best overall conditions. So Turkey is a huge market in football. It's a massive market. It has some of the most substantial problems, to the degree that players know that they sign a contract, they probably will not get all of that money in most of the clubs. Mm. If you compare it to a smaller market like Denmark, which is where you make a lot less money, but you know you're going to get it. Mm. And there is a correlation between what a market has been able to achieve in terms of the quality of contracts, the quality of the arbitration system to resolve disputes, the quality of the social protections, the overall professional conditions of medical support, and all of this, the coaching support around the teams, which that is actually a choice. It's not like you can't do it unless you're England. You can do it if you commit to it. And if you do, your market becomes a lot more stable, and you are able to present a much more sustainable economic product as well. And that is, I think, an underestimated correlation. And I like to use the example of Australia. It's a small market. It's in Australia, football is, I think, the 6th most popular sport. Rugby league, rugby union, AFL, like cricket, everything's more popular. Actually, netball, I think, is remotely more popular than football. But they've had an incredibly successful governance environment, which means that players wanted to stay because it's good living, it's good security, it's less money than in Malaysia, it's less money than in Indonesia, but I know I'm going to be secure. And I think that's an underestimated factor of retaining talent if you're a club, if you're a league, to actually be competitive. So there are some of these correlations, but they're not purely just economic strength. There are governance choices in it as well.
And you've been, obviously, the football athlete, or the athlete in general, is the core what you look at. But you have been mentioning the clubs as more or less the counterpart, or one of the counterparts. But there is then, and you have been mentioning government, or the regulatory system and so on. But now there is, you have been mentioning several times, you have been using the word arbitration and arbitrator. So there is these intermediaries between the football athlete, or the athlete in general, and the employer, which is typically the club. Now, but there is these advisors, these counselors, these arbitrators, working together, representing more or less the athlete with respect or towards against the club. How do you see the role? Are they really, acting in the interest of the player, of the athlete? I mean, obviously there will be different concepts, but just to talk about that, how do you see their role?
So a short clarification: when I say arbitrators, or when I say arbitration, I mean a court. Because normal labor courts for sports people don't really work because they take too long. So in football, we've actually internationally set up a very good arbitration system where you can go when your contract is not being honored. When you talk about agents, which are the people setting up the contracts, it's complex. It's very complex. There are good agents, and they fulfill a legitimate role because, of course, it's difficult for, like, when I search a job, I do the interview myself. I talk to my potential future employer. I negotiate my salary. Believe it or not, that's a bit more tricky for a football player or for a skier or for whatever. So there is a legitimate role in setting these things up, because we're so dependent on, like, if I'm employed, they're going to have to make me work. If I'm a football player, they put me on the bench. What do I do? So there is a legitimate role, but there are, of course, many bad apples who work in their self-interest and not in their client's self-interest. And very often we have cases in which we need to represent the players against their own agents because they've defrauded them of money, they've given them illegitimate advice and all these things. So it's a complex environment, and I try to look at it usually in 3 tiers. What people get excited about is this top tier where some of these agents are making a lot of money. Let's be very honest. They're making a lot of money, but the contract constructions behind them are very, very different from other environments. The problem that we have there, in my opinion, which is the biggest one, is this multi-representation construct. So an agent would represent the player, the club, the club where the player used to play in the same transaction. So conflict of interest, relatively obvious. The only conflict that is there is the own interest. So that is problematic. But for the rest of the players, you have sort of your core players, the good professionals, but the non-superstars. For them, the key is actually transparency. because there are a lot of cases in which the player may end up with a worse deal in the transaction than the agent, because the player doesn't understand the market. He doesn't see what's happening between the club and the agent. So there we need transparency, transparency, transparency. The player needs to, in my opinion, sign off on every euro that the agent is being paid. And then there's a third tier, and that is the really abusive one, where the player is so low in the market and is so dependent on opportunity that the agent actually controls him or her. Mm-hmm. And there are stories that are unbelievable. And there we're really talking about significant legal problems, which are criminal law problems, etc. But that is because of the, it's essentially like, if I'm the worst trade union leader in the world, my market position is bad. If I'm the best trade union leader in the world, I can probably pick and choose what I want, right? It's still capitalism in the end. And the agent oftentimes holds an enormous control over opportunity, because the player doesn't know how to leave the country. But in the country he's playing, there may be only a couple of clubs who are on a level that give him the opportunity to leave. So the agent becomes the key, and they abuse oftentimes this power. But that being said, there is a legitimate way of doing it. There are many agents who do it in a good way, but there are a lot of problems with it too.
Now I may look at my screen, and I see that questions come in after questions. Now, Hannes Profanta, I think he's an MCI alumnus. I'm not sure about it, but he asks you, Jonas, in the NBA, there is a National Players Association led by a still active player in Chris Paul.
Correct.
As far as I know, this is Johannes Profanta. As far as he knows, there's nothing similar to that in Europe and in the top 5 leagues here. Why is this the case?
It's not completely true. So the NBA Players Association is amongst the 5 most influential, and I agree. A good reason why they're so influential is because people like Chris Paul, people like LeBron James, actually have real leadership positions in these unions. That is significant. In Europe, when you look at Europe now, you have, it is actually a requirement for our members. They need to have active players on their boards. They do have active players. So, for example, until last year, he just stepped away from the board, but Giorgio Chiellini, who's the captain of the Italian national team, sat on the board of the union. And I think he's now been replaced by Donnarumma, the goalkeeper of AC Milan. So this does exist. It's true that it's not always necessarily the best players the way that it happens, especially in basketball. There's a dynamic that changes this, which is maybe interesting because he's apparently interested in US sports. One of the big reasons why the collective bargaining system there works at a much more influential way than in the rest of the world is because they're negotiating basically the economics. They're negotiating the share of revenue that the players take home, which means if the job of the union every, let's say, 6 to 8 years when these agreements run out is determining whether you make 10% more or less next year, or even a more significant change, of course, the role of this union is much more relevant for the players. And we don't have these systems in the rest of sports. Like very few countries have these revenue sharing agreements outside of the US sports. So you're negotiating more long-term issues. You're negotiating things that will benefit the next generation of players. So I think that changes a bit the dynamic in a self-critical way. But in the unions that are well-run, active players are at least representing a good share, usually the majority of the board.
Another question I have on my screen comes from Raquel Sobral Gomez. She's an MCI student, and she lives in the Netherlands. Yeah. Now, the question goes like this. Raquel, I live in the Netherlands, and I remember a while ago, according to the Dutch news, the number of professional football players with symptoms of anxiety or depression doubled during the corona crisis, as a study by Players Union FIFPro in collaboration with the University of Amsterdam has shown. Which countries were included in this study, and is there more? Is this more a European issue or more a national issue?
For the question about which countries, please give Rachel my email address also, or give me hers, then I'll send her the information. We've studied this for a while. I'll just speak about it a bit more broadly. Like usually these studies, they're run by our chief medical officer, who's also professor at the University of Amsterdam. And we've included certainly unions from, Australia participated in this, Scotland participated, the Netherlands. So it's not a domestic study. It is an international study. It's usually around, let's say, 5 to 12 countries or so that participate in this. And what we've already seen in the past is that before Corona, that depression, anxiety, and other kinds of these, let's say, entry-level psychological concerns are roughly twice as prevalent in the playing community than in the general population. And then during COVID, this increased again, which I think, to be honest, I think that would be applicable to most of the society. I think most people out there have a higher risk of being affected by this. So I don't think the increase is substantially higher for footballers than for others, but the starting point is already higher. And I think it has to do with a few things. Number one, most football players, male or female, have 1 or 2 year contracts. They go continuously into, is my career over or do I continue? If you get injured on a 1 year contract and you have another half year of injury time when the contract ran out, that might be it. There's a lot of, like, how many of us go into their workplace and they're being yelled at by 10, 20,000 people every day? Nobody. Injury is a very difficult thing if your whole self-identification is based on your physical capacities and your body all of a sudden doesn't perform, creates a lot of psychological pressures. So it is a very demanding, although it is, of course, when you're really successful, it's a very gratifying, it's a great job, but there's enormous pressure. And if you're not actually earning at the level that you say, look, I do this for 2-3 years and then I'm good anyways, then of course the economic pressures are the same as for everybody else in society. So there's a lot of problems there. And I'm happy to, especially if she's in the Netherlands anyways, I'm happy to share some of that information. And if she's interested, I'm sure we can have a conversation at some point in person again when Corona's over.
Thanks, Jonas. The question is already at your table. I forwarded it to you. Okay. So, but with the email address of Rachel, I hope she agrees that I've brought it together. Now, another question from Luca Comployer, is now what kind of contribution could a university possibly make to promote social dialogue and more participation in sports and in general in the society?
I guess that's a leading question that you can discuss with him afterwards again. I think one element that is quite important is actually demystifying a lot of these things that I've talked about. And I think that's where academia can play a very important role, especially in the absence of organizations like ours. I mean, fortunately, we have the means to run this research ourselves. If Luca wants to set up a union for, winter sports athletes, he doesn't have the means to run a global study that is scientifically on the level that you need it to be to change public policy, for example. So academia can play, I think, a huge role in creating a actually valid baseline of discussion that decision makers in sports and decision makers in government are forced to work with. The other part, more on a practical level, is of course that most of our unions are running partnership programs with university for specific educational programs for athletes. For most of them, the regular schedule of a physically present university course is very, very difficult. Training, competitions, etc. You need to create a lot more flexibility. Oftentimes, you need to stretch it out over a little bit longer period than the normal course runs. So these kinds of partnerships are worth a lot because they can set you up, of course, to to do what you want to do afterwards and to contribute to sport or whatever else you're passionate about afterwards. So these are, I think, a couple of things that are very pragmatic and that can be very impactful.
Actually, you have been looking at me, Jonas, when that I should be the person to be involved, and I'll be more than pleased. And to give you some insight, we have been introducing our first so-called online business administration program, a degree program, an undergraduate one, largely based on online delivery. And in this program, we have professional athletes from sailing to skiing to snowboarding to tennis, playing all over the world and being in training camps. And actually, we always get the feedback how supportive this is to their career, and also how much confidence it gives to them to have a solution afterwards, but also a fallback position in case of injuries or anything doesn't work as planned. Yeah?
Another thing that, especially as a slightly atypical university like yourself can do, you have a big network of corporate partners, and I would encourage anybody who runs a company to have a shot at hiring a professional athlete. Once they figure out what of their soft skills they can apply to a different professional environment, there'll be some of your top performers within a year's time. And we have a couple people on our staff, we literally hired them off their professional career with very little, at the desk work experience. But the leadership, the resilience against pressure, the cooperation, the team environment, the trigger to be excellence, right? Athletes are driven to be excellent. Every day they want to get a little bit better because otherwise they're finished. Once you start translating those things into a regular job, quote unquote, they will add a lot to your teams. So I really if there are people watching who are employing people, which I assume they are, these people will add a lot of ingredients that you will have a hard time finding in many others.
Totally agree to this statement, really. And we've been making the best experiences with earlier athletes or athletes also partly working at the same time. Now, what I would like to dive deeper into is the role of media. Yeah. Now, especially if you look at these underestimated sports or athletes or sports which are not as much, visible, not as well paid, not as, professionally organized and so on. And then if media rights, for instance, if we take a football player, an athlete, yeah, and he doesn't succeed, the media reports, the articles may be devastating, maybe, maybe just costing their career or creating so much negative emotion, and may also work in the other way. Yeah, and those athletes in general, more or less in every sport, those who succeed in their sports, those who perform, and those who have a positive communication skills, they may use the media also as more or less their supporters, their lawyers, their stronghold, also against other groups, for instance, against the clubs. But how would you see that? Yeah? The role of media in general in this relation?
It's massive. It's the influence is massive, and I could probably list 10 things that I see, but 4 things come to my mind. The one is when you look at non-traditional media, the network power of athletes has the top athletes has raised past the platform of clubs, leagues, federations, anybody. So both from what I talked about earlier in terms of impacting community conversations around equality and these things, but also from a commercial perspective, the best platform is the athlete. Marcus Rashford is probably a better platform than Manchester United. to be very, very simple about it. So that is one. Understanding that power is substantial. Two, media has an enormous impact in how a sport develops and how it is perceived, right? We're not all experts on what we're watching. The only sport that I can probably really judge in the depth by quality is basketball. A lot of the rest is how I'm perceiving it, how it's being broadcasted, how it's being talked about, whether it's considered like the glossy elite product or not. And in football, the way that women's football is being reported on makes it small. It shrinks its value. And we're slowly starting to crack that when we're talking about World Cups and like the most elite of the level. But when you go and actually see a match in the first row, the quality is completely different from what people actually expect. So, but it's not presented well enough, and the investment isn't there, and therefore the return on the investment isn't there. And of course, when you look outside of the big team sports, the way that public broadcasters choose to what they put on screen is substantial. How much women's Bundesliga has been broadcasted in Austria or in Germany in the last 10 years compared to men's? I mean, I don't think you get a percentage point. And if you then go into other smaller sports, winter sports get a lot of attention in Austria and in Germany, but volleyball, probably hardly any. So that means a lot for how the government also streams these things and how it wants to develop certain sports. The third thing I would say, which goes into what you mentioned before, I always say people love to hate football players. They love to tear them to shreds, right? And the media plays a huge part in that. But what people don't understand is that they're humans. Like, they read the stuff, at least until a certain point, and then they start to channel it, and they probably don't read as much about it. But does it leave a mark? Of course. If you switch on your phone and every social media comment, is tearing into you, that you're not worth the salary you're making, or that you don't deserve to play for the club, of course that affects. And media triggers that too. The last thing that I would say, and that actually is a nice segue, so I can go to the last slide just so we finish that as well. The media has played a quite important role from an investigative standpoint to hold sports to account. And the image that you see here, these are members of the Afghanistan women's national team, a team that for the longest time didn't even exist because the religious and societal beliefs meant that women shouldn't play any football. They established their own team. At some point, the federation had to accept them. And we've worked over the last years a lot with them because they were part of one of the biggest sexual abuse scandals that international sport has seen. They had to flee the country. They had to fight to get this federation president who was part of the perpetrators. He was the number one perpetrators, raping women who played on his senior women's national team. Got him kicked out of sports, got him banned for life out of sports. But of course, he will probably never find justice in Afghanistan. And the media played a huge role from an investigative standpoint to support these kinds of stories. A second case, very similar case of women and girls in Haiti that just led to a lifetime ban of that federation president, started with investigative media reporting by The Guardian. So there's also, with some of the dark sides of sport that we're dealing with, the media can play a very, very important role as well, and it has at times. So those are maybe 4 dimensions of media and sports which are relevant, I think, to consider and to start working with.
Fascinating insight, and perhaps never ending to talk about. But one thing I have on my list is, for instance, now you have been talking about racism. You have been talking about sexual abuse. You have been talking about discrimination and so on. But now, isn't it a certain principle in sports and perhaps also in society that everything which is more or less new, perceived new, it doesn't have to be new, but which is perceived new, that this creates some, concerns, some fun. Now, come on, women playing football. How stupid is this? Or you may put the same logic or the same approach when it comes to racism or when it comes to sexual orientation, which is or has been an issue in more or less in society, but also in professional sports, because there is different sexual orientations, and now all the attention, especially in social media, lots of attention, and perhaps also aggression is put on these topics. Isn't it the case that everything which is somehow new or which we aren't used to has a tendency to be confronted with negative emotions at least at the beginning?
I guess it's a very philosophical question and psychological question. And now we're both sitting here as white men who probably didn't have the hardest time in comparison to get where we are. I'm pretty sure if I wasn't a white man, I would not have led this kind of an organization in my early 30s. So it's always, I think we have to be careful with how we judge these things. I've never been discriminated against in my life for anything. So I think what is important, what we're talking about essentially, I think what you're referring to is in the end biases, conscious and subconscious biases that we have. And they exist all over society, and nobody can claim not to have them. You grow up and you're being socialized around certain biases. The question is, how do we deal with them? Do we face them, and do we try to step past them and therefore create more equality and probably become better human beings? What happens in sport, I think, is that number one, it's very public. Number two, people think they deserve to have an opinion about athletes. I don't think everybody believes that they deserve to have an opinion about you. But I think everybody believes they deserve to have an opinion about whether what David Alaba did in leaving Bayern Munich was the right thing to do or not. And then the third thing is that, like I said, it brings people from all kinds of belief systems, social backgrounds together in a melting pot. And that is not always pretty. I mean, these things exist in our societies, and sport gives them a platform where it comes out. And then the final thing is, I always sometimes think is athletes are they're the last gladiators that we have. Sport is the last environment, at least in our westernized societies, in which being for and against, in which competition in an aggressive way is actually, it's being perceived as something positive. And I think that brings out certain, deep intrinsic things that we have in our brains back from, fight and flight when we were still crawling around and hunting and picking things up from the floor. I think these things sometimes come out in sport. And it makes it a complex environment for athletes to navigate. And I understand, I would hope that in the future we have a much more embracing environment in which sexuality, especially in men's football, is not an omerta. It's not something that is being silenced. But it is a complex environment, not because of the players. I've talked to so many players about this. It's not such a big issue in the dressing room. It's a problem in the rest of society with how they believe they can judge you. But yeah, there is a lot of work that we have to do as sports, but I guess also just as human beings to be a bit more open-minded.
Now, Pier Antonelli, he sits in Milan, and he is an MCI student, has sent me a question, and that goes like this. Dear Jonas, thank you very much for this very, very nice insight. What are key topics for you to be addressed, or key aims for you for the next years?
How much time do I have? It's a lot, because from what you've heard in just this conversation of the last hour, one thing that is really exciting about my job, but which also I guess makes it a bit hard, is that we're dealing with the problems from the elite to the really most basic professionalism. So prioritizing between that is difficult, but these players need very different things. But one priority clearly is that, football especially, I always say they made a promise to the players about 10 years ago that everybody would have access to a court where they could defend themselves. Everybody would have access to a standard contract. Didn't deliver on it. And in this COVID period, where so many players were going through enormous hardship, I mean, we had some of our members were handing out food bags to players because they couldn't put even basic needs on the table. But that is not in England, that is in Thailand, or that is in Bolivia, etc., where things are very, very different. So making sure that everybody has decent and dignified employment in football would probably be the number one goal. I think number two, there is some regulatory big things like, the transfer system, like these things are substantially impacting the market and probably are working at large against the players' interest that we're trying to change, but that's a complex legal and macroeconomic discussions I would have to open. And then maybe the third thing is everything around equality and around these human rights questions that are, everything literally from racial equality, gender equality, and these human rights questions like sexual abuse, freedom of speech, etc. So those are maybe 3 buckets that I would fill, but probably if I continue to talk, that'd be another 8 that I would have to open up.
Now, we have been over exploiting your time slot, Jonas, and also the time of our audience. But perhaps I may bring in one final question from the audience and then one from my side. Kevin O'Donnell, he is an MCI alumnus now in Manchester, and he wants to know which are the key bottlenecks, the hurdles regarding your work. I mean, if you have goals, you have been mentioning some of them, but what is it there? What it is to overcome? What are the bottlenecks? Is it financial? Is it regulation? Is it whatever? Yeah. How do you see that?
Yeah, first of all, I hope he wasn't too mad about my Manchester United comment, depending on whether he sits on the City or the United.
Say anything about it.
Okay, then I guess he likes Marcus Rashford. It's a good question. And then, I mean, in football, rarely the problem is really financial. Now, of course, if you work in 65 countries and you have Gabon and you have Serbia, yes, in some countries it is financial, but it's a luxury position compared to any other sport. So I try not to use that as a reason, because football could just redistribute money differently and then everybody would have enough, probably. I guess the biggest challenge is governance, the democratization of the governance of football from a labor perspective, from an industrial perspective, is probably the biggest thing that's holding us back. And as an example, which maybe just symbolize this a bit and goes back to what I talked about previously, in this COVID period, a lot of things, it was understandable why some players made certain concessions, right? I think we've all followed that debate on how much the clubs needed to sustain their business. And in some cases that was well handled and well negotiated. But if you take, for example, Indonesia, it's not a huge football market for us, but it's 300 million people who are absolutely crazy about football. And a lot of these clubs are owned by billionaires who are, richer than any of us will ever become. The Indonesian Football Federation had the idea very early on in this pandemic to unilaterally, without ever talking to the union, talking to the players, to decide that all contracts, all wages are cut by 70%. Players are stuck with 30% of their income. How many people are out there in society that can live off of 30% of their income? Not a lot. And these guys are not making the kind of wages we're talking about with, people playing at City or at United. And the fact that that is possible, that football allows that to happen, and that it doesn't say, no, well, wait a second. If you want to do that, you need an agreement with your players. You need to be transparent about your financials and actually explain why you need to make a social reconstruction of your work, conditions and all of this. But football allows this to happen still. In Serbia, our union is running more than 200 court cases every year in a country that has probably not more than 350 professional football jobs. They run more than 200 cases a year for non-payment of wages because the clubs just don't. Those are the kinds of things that the governance of football still allows and that I think are the biggest bottlenecks for real change. So, yeah, I guess that's my answer.
And Yeah, perhaps the last question we just came in. Davide Ambrosetti, he is an MCI student now in Firenze, in Florence, and he wants to know, perhaps there may be also a certain interest in the answer, obvious, but a specific interest. Yeah? Now, which is the best football league in the world from your perspective?
You're asking a basketball player that. That's it's tough. I mean, if you go by economics, it's clearly England, Premier League, not close. What speaks for the Premier League, in my opinion, is that while it has obviously a competitive imbalance, it has far less of a competitive balance than most other major leagues. In Germany, let's say we have Bayern is always gone more or less, and then you have everybody else competing for either going down or qualifying for Europa League or Champions League. Italy and France are very, very anti-competitive, two very dominant clubs usually, although Italy is a bit better at the moment. But the Premier League has at least 6, 7, 8 clubs that usually can compete at a pretty high level. So I think that makes it very attractive. I personally like the style of play because it's quite athletic. But somebody else might like Spanish football better because it's technically, more advanced. So I don't know. I think I'm not the best person to really ask about football. I always say I could do this job for people who, hit the ball with a bat or who, throw it into a hoop, or it doesn't really matter because I don't do this because of football. I do it because of, representing the people, and I tend to understand the environment in which they work. So I do it for athletes instead of somebody else. So I'm not the best person to ask, but probably I would go with the Premier League when you look at all the things that come together.
Now, looking at my watch, I really am already concerned that we have been we have been now talking about abusing your time and your generosity. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, for giving us insight, and also showing emotion. What kind of of aspects you would see and how to move forward. And so I think this is a lot of learning, and also for perhaps people out there in the audience, perhaps now being more interested in professional football players or athletes to recruit them as employees. Thank you so much, dear Jonas BaerHoffmann. Thank you to your confederation, to the FIFPro, to the association. We've been very, very much enjoying this time slot, this Distinguished Guest Online Live Talk. And when it comes to a little outlook, I would just mention if I may, and then I would give back the word to you briefly for to say goodbye or to say whatever farewell to our audience. Now, in a week from now, Friday next week, March 26th, in this case, 2 p.m., we have a very prominent guest coming out of an infrastructural company, a very large one, Deutsche Bahn. And he is a member of the management board responsible for human resources and legal affairs, Martin Seiler. And he will talk about how do we work in the future, including qualifications, competencies, and requirements. Then on Thursday, April the 8th at 5 p.m., we will welcome Michael Popp, the chief executive of Bionorica, a large and dynamically growing pharmaceutical company, phytopharmaca, using the essence of plants, talking about winning the future with green biotech, so-called phyto or phytoengineering. And perhaps the last event I would like to mention is Friday, the 16th of April, and it will be the Economic Forum of South Tyrol, being organized by the MCI jointly with partners in South Tyrol, like Unternehmerverband, like Südtiroler Wirtschaftszeitung, and more. And we will talk about perspectives for the time after Corona, including distinguished guests like Christoph Hettich, the co-founder and co-chief executive of Baer-Hoffmann Biotech Holding, and the chairman of the board of SRH Holding in Heidelberg. I think you know him, or at least the institution. Angie Gifford, the vice president, Central Europe of Facebook in Berlin, and Alexander Nick, the founder and chief executive of Properly in San Francisco, a very successful startup. So Friday, April the 16th, you see that we will have a nice, very, very prominent and nice composition of distinguished guests to enjoy. Now, Jonas, once again, thank you so much for being part. Thanks to the audience for sharing their time, and thanks to all those sending in questions. They make our live talk vivid and enjoyable. So, warm regards from my side. Enjoy the evening, and now the final word is with you, dear Jonas.
Final word. So I'll close the loop back to when we talked about your students in the beginning. You asked the question, how do you get to what I do? And I guess the one thing that I could share with the students is find a real passion. Then the rest becomes easy. The one thing that has led me through this is that I'm really passionate, and I guess that came across a little bit today about doing what I'm doing. So if you find that, you'll be fine, whatever your, the grades on your degree look like. But thank you very much for having me. It was a good amount of fun. So anytime again.
Thank you. All the best. Enjoy the evening.